Hello. Good afternoon. Is this close enough to my? Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah, marvellous. Oh, bad luck. Good afternoon. People are still coming in. It's fantastic to have so many people here. It's really good. Thank you. Do come in. So I'm Judith Holder, and I'm a Common Room member at the college, and it's been my privilege to organise today's event to mark International Women's Day. It's something that we've begun to do every year, and this year it falls within Bletchley Park Week, which as you may know, has included a lot of events and talks within college during the past week, including the Enigma machine that was here earlier on this week, and a visit to Bletchley Park yesterday. For those of you who don't know, the college has a strong connection with Bletchley Park. It was the famous secret code-breaking establishment set up during World War II that Churchill described as the goose that laid the golden egg but didn't cackle. Typically beautifully put by Churchill, of course. And its secret intelligence work is thought to have shortened the conflict by something like 2 years. It was obviously a very significant place. And apart from that, it also devised the world's first electronic programmable computer, Colossus, which helped break the codes and eventually led to the modern computer. The rest, as they say, is history. And as an aside, Jonathan Mickey, who's the president here, his father, Donald Mickey, was Alan Turing's chess partner at Bletchley. Is that right? Is that right? Yeah, yeah. So we have a strong connection. Bless you. The theme for this year's International Women's Day is women in the workplace. And we have 3 very special people here this evening who span some 80 years of women in the workplace. And obviously a great deal has happened in those 80 years, which perhaps we'll talk about. First of all, we have Webb MBE, who was one of the famous Bletchley Park girls, who will speak about her time working at Bletchley Park amongst thousands of other women in total secrecy during the war. We have Baroness Hayter of Kentish town, who was made a life peer 7 years ago and is the sort of Baroness whose work is regularly seen in the papers, I hope she doesn't mind me saying that, who is now Shadow Deputy Leader of the House of Lords and was Shadow Spokesperson on equality and women's issues until last year. And we have Siegel, who's a student representative here and is doing a master's here at Kellogg in evidence-based social intervention and policy evaluation. And we'll talk about the gender differences in the field of medicine. Gosh, we're going to be short of chairs. Do grab some of these. So there's going to be plenty of time at the end for questions, but we're going to start with Betty, and I'm going to interview Betty. Don't think it was my idea, I think it was her idea, and hear about the important part that she played in breaking Japanese codes and ciphers, the understanding of which was so vital to winning the war in the Far East. And she went on afterwards to write a book called Secret Postings, Bletchley Park to the Pentagon, also about her time at the Pentagon that followed. 75% of the people working at Bletchley were women, but they were paid something between half and a third of the men, although they were never apparently allowed to speak about it. So I'm going to start by interviewing Betty. So Betty, you can everyone hear at the back? So on, yeah. Betty, you. Is this turned on? Sorry. Am I turned on? Can you hear what I'm saying? Yeah, you said I didn't need to do anything to the mic, but it doesn't sound as if it's on to me either. Oh, okay. Right. It's not for this room, it's for people around the world. Right, so we'll okay. So can you actually hear at the back? Yes, good, right. So, Betty, you were a clerk in special intelligence duties, and you were 18 when you arrived at Bletchley in 1941. Tell us about, first of all, how you came to be recruited and why you were recruited.
Well, I've always understood that when I joined the ATS, that's the Auxiliary Territorial Service, I didn't really know what I wanted to do in the way of a trade. and I had put on my CV that I spoke German, and I think that was why I was called for to be interviewed by an intelligence officer in London, which I did, and after half an hour's talk, he told me to get myself to Euston on the train for Bletchley. I'd never heard of Bletchley and certainly didn't know what was going on there, but that was my introduction to the secret world of Bletchley Park.
And how secret was it, Betty? What was told? What were you told about the secrecy?
Oh, very secret indeed. We had to sign the Official Secrets Act. Having signed it, I realised that any leaking from me in the way of talking or writing or anything else outside my own office, I would have been in dire trouble. I believe that the worst punishment would have been death, depending on the degree of your revelations.
Sounds quite serious.
It was, it was.
And I gather your parents sadly didn't live to
No,
know
that's
about
right.
it.
No, both my parents died before I was at liberty to tell them what I'd been doing.
Yes.
It's a sadness which many of us are experiencing.
And tell us about some of the working conditions and so on at Bletchley. What was it like?
Well, fairly basic, because bearing in mind we're talking about 1941, and the heating in the mansion where I worked was fires, which usually went out long before the end of the shift, so that was a bit uncomfortable. And I understand that in the huts it was even worse, because they were very basic buildings, and the heat in the summer was unbearable, and the cold in the winter equally unbearable.
Yeah, and what exactly were you doing? What was the process of your work?
Well, to begin with, I was registering the messages which had come in through our signal people around the world. Mainly, I understood quite late on that the ones I was handling were to do with the Holocaust. And I was working for a major tester where I had to register all the messages and put the details onto a little card index so that Major Tester in particular, who was a linguist, and I think possibly a codebreaker as well, I'm not sure, but he would be able to call on any particular message at any particular date. The messages were not in the clear. I never knew until many years later exactly what I was handling, because everything was in groups of either 5 letters or 5 figures.
Yes, and presumably you weren't aware of what was going on in the Holocaust at all.
Not at all, no. I discovered that many years later.
It was an environment that was very dominated by women, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Not all the time, but at the height of that activity, I understand that the ratio was 3 to 1.
And did you have, did it feel like an egalitarian environment to work in or not?
No, not really. No, I found it all very, very easy, actually.
Yeah, yeah. And the fact that you weren't paid as much as your male counterparts, can you tell us a bit about, if you like, the kind of social expectations at that time and how they were different to now?
That's quite a difficult one to answer, really, because I was very young and very inexperienced, and I didn't really, at the time, I didn't really understand those things.
But did you think to question what you might be earning compared to men there?
No, I don't think I did. I mean, bearing in mind I was on an army rate, a fixed rate depending on rank, there was no question. I just accepted that. And incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, we had 10 and 6pence a week.
But perhaps would it be true to say that in those days that women were, if you like, expected to be looked after by their parents
Oh,
and
yes.
then by their husbands? In
Oh,
terms
absolutely, yes. There wasn't the freedom that there is today, women to go out and earn their own livelihood.
Yeah. And were you aware of the importance of the work that was going on in Bletchley?
Not at the time, no. Because we were so confined to the one office, as I say, I never had the opportunity to discover just how we were affecting the war.
Yeah.
It was many years afterwards that I realised the importance of it.
There were some very eminent code breakers that were women as well, weren't there? I'm thinking of Joan Thirsk.
Yes, and Mavis Beatty and people like that. That's
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
There again, I didn't know them, and at the time, I don't think they started off as code breakers. That was discovered later.
Yes. I think Joan Thirsk broke more codes than Alan Turing, didn't he? Didn't she, I think?
Could well be, I'm
Yes,
not
yeah.
sure.
What was the atmosphere? I mean, you said there were some fun things about being at Bletchley. Tell us about those.
Oh, yes. I mean, we had a very hard working system. It was either 8 till 4, 4 to midnight, or midnight to 8. But we also had the opportunity to take part in lots of things, such as madrigal singing, and there was an orchestra, and we had a drama group, and there was also plenty of opportunity for sport. So it was a very balanced life. It was hard work, but we did have the opportunity to relax in whatever things we were interested in.
Do you think that atmosphere gave you a sort of resilience and a kind of independence that has seen that has?
Oh,
been good
yes,
for you in
I
later
think
life?
so. I think it had an effect on me throughout the rest of my life, yes. Certainly in matters where you need to be discreet and so on.
Yes, yes, yes. I imagine you're very good at that. Do you think some of the work that you were doing at Bletchley was better suited to women than men? I mean, was there, obviously there was a practical reason why there were a lot of women there, because the men were conscripted. But what was it about being a woman, do you think, that made your work easier?
Well, I think that women at that time, they joined up because they wanted to, in the main. After I joined up, women were conscripted. I wasn't. It was my idea to go into the army. And I just told myself to go along with it.
Yeah, yeah. You've obviously got a very pragmatic approach to life, which has done you very well. After the war, Betty, you went on to work at the Pentagon. Tell us
That's
about that.
right. Yeah. Well, after the war in Europe ended in June 45, I think I'm right in saying, yes, I was posted to the Pentagon to continue doing what I'd been doing at Bletchley, which in the later years was paraphrasing decoded and translated Japanese messages. And that was a fairly serious thing to be doing, because what we didn't want was for the Japs to realise that we'd broken their codes. So the paraphrasing had to be done very carefully, so that if the Japs had picked up the messages, they wouldn't have realised that we had, in fact, decoded their messages. So it was a fairly responsible job, which I did in the Pentagon until the bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in August, which was obviously when the war ended. But I had a wonderful time in Washington, in the Pentagon, with 32,000 other people. Yes, 32,000 for lunch. Can you imagine?
And how many British people working there?
I don't know exactly how many. I would suggest that I'm aware of about 40 or 50, I'm not sure.
Not many.
Not
at
many,
all.
no.
Gosh, yes, yeah. And when you came home, tell us a bit about what happened to you when you returned after the war.
Well, to begin with, there was a lot of hanging about until what we called our demob date. In fact, I wasn't demobbed until February 1946. So it was quite a bit of hanging about, but never mind. I went home for a rest, and then I had various... first of all, I went to a secretarial college in London, and then I had various jobs, secretarial jobs, until I went back into the TA, and then I was offered permanent jobs with TA units around the country. And when that ended, I can't remember the exact date, it doesn't matter, I then went on to being the recruiting officer for the Women's Royal Army Corps in the Birmingham area. And that was quite a big job, which I did for 11 years. And then I went on to work for Birmingham Law Society, and I was there for 16 years, which is when I retired in after which I retired in 1986.
So you've been retired for 30 years?
Yes, I've been busier ever since.
Betty, you were saying to me that you felt a little uneasy about how well women were recognised, or rather not recognised, for their contribution in the war. Can you tell us a bit about that perhaps you feel under-recognised?
Well, it was very difficult to recognise any of us who worked at Bletchley. We come back to this security thing. But I think by and large, people didn't realise how important many other branches of the women's services were, especially the ones who were on the ACAC sites, because an awful lot of us were killed. It's a horrifying picture if you look in the internet, the number of graves of ATS ladies who served on the continent. It's horrendous.
Yes.
And I don't think we have had sufficient recognition.
Yeah.
Because the ATS became the Women's Royal Army Corps in 1949, and there again, I don't think general public realised what a splendid job they did.
So, in terms of the future, Betty, what are your ambitions going forward?
What, for personal things?
Yeah.
Well, I've just got to keep active, otherwise I might go downhill.
I know you spend a lot of time doing talks and signing your book. So,
yes,
yeah.
that's right. I'm very fortunate in that the public like to hear about Bletchley, and I have up to now done about, I suppose, 140, 150 talks. I'm doing one tomorrow, and I've got several others lined up for the rest of the year. And I find it's jolly good. It keeps me thinking, and it keeps me from moping around.
Moping around, that's a good way of putting it. Good. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. Thank you. So next, Maya Siegel is taking a break from her medical studies at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore to do her master's here. She plans to pursue family medicine with a focus on women's health and reproductive justice. Her interests include access to family planning services, improving women's health care in primary care setting, and addressing disparities in health and healthcare. So, Maya, please.
Thank you. First, I just want to thank you for having me. You're both such impressive women. So as you mentioned, I'm getting my master's here, and I'm very interested in the disparities with women's access to healthcare, and that could be a whole nother talk about how the fact that the way most women present when they have a heart attack is still considered the abnormal presentation, or if a woman collapses, she is much less likely to receive CPR, but that is a whole nother subject. But within the medical field, there's a lot of disparities, and while it has gotten a lot better over the past 100 years, women are allowed into medical school now, so that was a big first step. But there's still a lot that needs to be gained, and people often start to experience this prior to even entering medical school. When I was on the interview trail, as they call it, prior to going to medical school, at every school I interviewed at, they'd ask, why do you want to be a doctor? And I'd give this really long, very nice, thought-out response, very specific to why I wanted to be a physician. And then I would get asked, so why not just become a nurse? Which missed the point of the previous 5 minutes of what I had spoken about, so I would just politely repeat myself. And within medical school, there's also a lot of both small and large things that people experience. On my orthopedics rotation, one of my friends was assigned the pediatric orthopedic specialty for her 2 weeks, and she was told that they thought that she would enjoy hanging out with children more. She's going into urology. She doesn't care about hanging out with children. She wanted to see the traumas. And then that also continues the amount of times I've been mistaken for a nurse while wearing white coat and scrubs. I've lost count, and I also know of someone who's training to become an ophthalmologist who their mentor didn't invite them to surgeries with them because he said that he didn't know what he would talk about with her in the surgeries, so he just didn't train her in that specialty. But something that I find very interesting about the medical field is that it's very it's introspective. It's a bunch of researchers, so they're going to research themselves as well, and there's been a lot of data recently, especially in the last 10 years, related to the disparities of women in medicine. And a lot of it is related to achievement in academic medicine. So in the United States, only 16% of medical school deans are women. In Canada, the last number I saw was 6% of deans are women, which was 1 for the medical schools. And it's often blamed on the pipeline issue that, oh, it's just because only now are there equal numbers of men and women in medical school, and eventually if we wait, it'll fix itself. Well, for the past 20 years, there's been about equal numbers of men and women in medical school, and that pipeline hasn't really changed at all. And especially for women of color, that pipeline is even worse. So I go to Johns Hopkins. It's in Baltimore, which is a majority black city. 2% of my medical school class is black women. Sorry, less than 2% because there's 2 out of a class of 120. And that's common throughout the medical field, and that there's a very big disparity in all of the statistics I give for women. Keep in mind that these statistics are often worse in terms of disparities for women of color. Also, once you become a physician, it doesn't quite end. There was a very interesting recent study where, looking at publicly available data, they saw that when a male surgeon has a case where he did unexpectedly well, they did not think the patient would do well, and it was a miracle, he gets a bump in referrals and is rewarded financially for that. If a female surgeon has a similar case, there's not that same reward. And if a male surgeon has a case where there's a mistake or an unexpectedly bad outcome, there's a small dip in referrals, but it comes back to the baseline immediately. Whereas for female surgeons, they see a significant reduction in the amount of patients referred to them. And it's not even for the surgeon who made the mistake, but all female surgeons in the area, there's a lowering of the referrals to them, that people seem to blame the entire gender for the mistake of one, which I find very amusing because there was a recent article in 2017 in the British Medical Journal that showed that female surgeons have better outcomes in terms of mortality, 30-day readmission, and 30-day complication rates. So if you're choosing, one so far seems to have less likelihood of death. And this is also seen in the research setting as well, of women principal investigators in the medical field get fewer grants, even if on the grant applications there's more positive wording. And you had mentioned that women aren't recognized as much within for their achievements, which reminds me of my favorite joke at the moment, which is, what did Watson and Crick discover? And the answer is Rosalind Franklin's notes. But that sense of achievement and sense of being acknowledged for what you have earned is less in the medical field as well, even in terms of being called a doctor by other doctors. At most hospitals, there's a thing called grand rounds every week, where it's an honor to give a speech on a topic that you know well. And they looked at, when people are introduced, are they referred to by doctor last name, or are they referred to by their first name? And when females are introducing the other doctor who's giving the talk, they're often referred to as, whoever they're introducing as, Dr. Last Name is here to give their esteemed talk. Whereas when male presenters are introducing the person giving the grand rounds, when they're introducing a female, they're much likely to just introduce them by their first name, as opposed to when they introduce a male, it's Dr. Last Name. And there's a lot of little subtle things. After having a pregnancy in their family, female physicians are ranked lower in evaluations by their colleagues than male physicians who had a birth in their family as well. But there's hope. It's not all bad. Because it is such an introspective field, there's a lot of research being done on also how to try and overcome these gender biases within the field of medicine. There's some interesting studies in different medical schools where they're having implicit bias training and interventions to see if that changes outcomes in terms of promoting. And there's several committees within the American Association of Medical Colleges to try and address the disparities. But there's people are in a bind female physicians are in a bind because they also get some discrimination from patients. Male patients are less likely to return to a female physician than they are to a male physician for a primary care appointment after they've had a single one, whereas there's not the same discrepancy with female patients. And female physicians also have to often deal with harassment from patients, both with sexual harassment or being making inappropriate comments, and unlike other fields, you can't, as a physician, just say, "Oh no, I'm not going to save your life. I'm sorry." And so they're often in a position to kind of suffer through and persevere. But hopefully, it'll change soon as more people go into medicine and more people within medicine realize that it's an issue and that it's something that needs to be changed.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So finally, we are very privileged to have Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town, who's going to talk about, I think, women in the workplace, and with particular reference of women in the political sphere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you've depressed me. And in fact, I brought this book along, not thinking I was going to refer to it because it's called Man-Made Language. But the awful thing is, it's nearly 40 years ago. And the examples it's given are almost exactly the same as the ones you're giving. So 40 years on, there's still a bit of a problem, which is a bit of a shame. However, even worse, because if any of you read Mary Beard, Women in Power, it starts even earlier than that. So we do make some progress, but Mary Beard said it takes a long, long time. So I want to talk a bit about today's situation, why it matters, and even more, because we've got lots of young, active people here, what we should do about it, how to make change. So if I start about the pay gap, because that is, it is only a symptom, you know, I think the recognition in that is important, but clearly, you know, we need to know what the pay gap is. It has improved. It's down for full-time women. It's now only 9% difference between men and women's pay. However, if you look at the whole of the workforce, it's 18%, because so many women work part-time, because they tend to do more of the caring, and many part-time jobs are low paid, and also people miss out on promotion and experience if they're part-time, so it's harder for them to progress. But it isn't just about that, because when I started, I thought I'd better just check on my figures before I arrived. In fact, there was a piece in The Guardian, I don't know if you saw it this week, where teachers, you know, where we're not talking about a long, long pay scale, you know, in a big company, but even for teachers, there was a woman teacher who was paid £7,000 a year less than her male equivalent, which seems extraordinary. And in fact, for teachers overall, which seems, again, extraordinary, for education, there's a 26% difference. We're getting a quarter less than, we only get 3/4 of what men do. In fact, on the whole, on women, we only started earning this month. In other words, we earn so much less as women that basically January and February we work for free. And we only start getting paid the equivalent from March. And interestingly, it isn't just the most of part-time work is done by women, and a lot of that is low paid because of the sort of jobs it is in catering and stuff like that. But it isn't just at that level. That if we look at the senior levels, university vice-chancellors, I don't know why that comes to mind, or heads of the Supreme Court, or judges, or businesses, virtually everywhere, men are at the top. And interestingly, you know, you talk about the pipeline. We've even longer for women, the same number of women going into law. But if you look at the top of the legal profession, it's still a funnel. They start actually almost equal numbers, but even for the amount of time they've been there, they haven't caught up. And companies, if any of you are wanting a career in business, I'm afraid that a study of the top basically 100 companies in the UK, this is, have actually slightly slipped backwards. In 2016, 7.8% of them had a female chief executive officer or boss, and this year it's dropped down to 6.5%. So, you know, the big companies, many of which, by the way, are either producing goods that women buy, or running organisations which employ women, or doing something of real importance to women, but they're actually being run by men. I'm sorry if the men in the room are going to start getting uncomfortable, but I know about half of them and they're used to this, so it's all right. The other thing is the recognition gap. I was really interested that you used the word recognition, because again and again, the women doing top jobs don't get the same recognition. We have more knighthoods than damehoods. They're the sort of equivalent in the honours scheme. But if you look at the sad people like me who go through the New Year's honours and the birthday honours, it's always far more men than women, even for head teachers. And yet, of course, many, many head teachers are women, but they don't get the same recognition. And that happens everywhere. Turning to politics, of course, it is the big year, isn't it? 100 years of women first. Not all women, but women aged 30 getting the vote. But interestingly, it was in February, 6th of February, which was the actual anniversary of some women getting the vote, not all the women. And I got curious about why was that happening in February 1918 when we were still at war? Because I sort of had this myth that women only got the vote because of what they were doing during the First World War. So I was rather surprised they got it during the First World War, not after it. And the reason, of course, is actually men. They had to bring in a greater franchise for men because of all the soldiers that had been fighting during the First World War to make sure by the end of the war they had the vote. And then women snuck in and got it then. So the timing of that wasn't even specifically for women, but we did get it. There's a slight problem is that almost 100 years later, it took till 2015 for the number of women ever elected to Parliament to be the same as the number of men in Parliament on any one day. So over 100 years, if you add up all the women over that time, until the 2015 election, there were still fewer than any one House of Commons, how many men there were there. There's still fewer women ever been in the cabinet than the number of Davids in the cabinet, and so it goes on. So we've made progress in 100 years, but it's a bit slow. Today, there are 208 women MPs, but of course there's more than double that of male MPs. So we're only still 32%. We're only a third still. And given that, we're meant to represent, or Parliament's meant to represent the whole country, we're some way short of that. I'm a Labour politician, and I have to say we've done slightly better than the others. We've got a much higher proportion of our women Labour MPs a higher portion of Labour MPs are women than for the Conservatives, but then you would expect that really. This year is also the 60th anniversary of women going into the House of Lords. Prior to the 1958 Life Peerages Act, there were basically only hereditary men in the House of Lords. So it's the 60th anniversary of that, which, given I'm in the House of Lords, of course, I think that's quite important. And a quarter of the people in the House of Lords are women. That's 210 women members of the House of Lords. But given that 92 have to be men, because we still have 92 hereditaries who by definition are men, the fact that we've got 210 women actually isn't too bad. We have a female leader of the House of Lords. We have both a female leader and deputy leader of the opposition in the House of Lords. And interestingly, we had to have a man to break a sort of a plastic ceiling rather than a glass ceiling, in that our first two speakers in the House of Lords were women. And we've only just had a man there, so he feels that he had to break through a little ceiling to get there. And you probably saw that last month, which was in the anniversary month, which is very nice, we had our first ever female black rod. It's only 650 years since they invented the title Black Rod, but we now have a woman black rod. But we have a long way to go. Jackie Smith quite recently was the first woman Home Secretary. We still have not had a female Chancellor of the Exchequer. We haven't had a female Defence Secretary. So we have some way to go to get there. And the same in the media, where Judith comes from, dominated by men there. and it's more or less whichever area you go to. Even female fashion is actually still dominated by men. And the world I'm working in at the moment, because I'm the Shadow Minister on Brexit, so following all the EU withdrawal very closely, you know, the names you hear are Jean-Claude Juncker, Guy Verhofstadt, Donald Tusk, Boris Johnson, David Davis, Liam Fox. You know, the whole of this negotiation is alpha male. They're not just men, but they are real alpha male negotiating. And in fact, although we have a female Prime Minister in this country, if you are following this, you will see that when she makes a speech, she is then sort of being bullied. I think there's no other word, by Michael Gove and David Davis and Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg. And you will notice that they all are men. So even when you get to the very top position, there is still a challenge there. Get to the top. Don't be put off by this. But it happens there. Now, I happen to work with some amazing men who have gone through in their lives that difference, and the really good ones are superb about it. I mean, there are some real feminists amongst men, at least two in the room, and I'm sure a couple of others. It's only that I only know two of them, that's why. And one of my colleagues, who is maybe mid-70s, said that when he came to the Lords, he'd never ever worked for a woman. And since he's been in the Lords, he's only ever worked for women. And he said, you know, it took him some time. He's absolutely a great colleague. But it is interesting that there is therefore a generation for whom this is absolutely new, having a female boss. Now, that can just sound like, you know, I'm a woman, I gripe. But actually, is this important? Does it matter? And I think it makes I think it's enormously important. Clearly, it's unfair to the women who don't get on, but actually, as a society, we're losing the contribution of those women who are not in positions of authority. And there are real problems about the way society works if women aren't well represented there. One of them is we often call the need for grit in the oyster. You need someone to be a bit difficult sometimes, because otherwise you get groupthink. In other words, if you, and it's happening to many of my colleagues at the moment, they're all very anti-Brexit, and they spend all their time talking to people just like them. And it's quite hard, therefore, for them to think about how to change anything, because they're not meeting and working with people with a different approach. But think in any other area, it can be the same. And the idea of always being on a committee, or if you're working with a work group, whether it's in a lab as a scientist or with a doctor's group, actually, even if it's a patient there, if you all come from very similar background, it's much harder to say, is that quite right, or might there be another approach? And of course, therefore, we risk decisions not being taken that are as good as they could be if you don't have a much wider group. And it is quite difficult to be that grit of in the oyster if you're the only one. I mean, as late as the year 2000, which, you know, isn't that long ago, I was on a very senior committee, a national committee, and I was the only woman in the room. It was the Board for Actuarial Standards. Isn't that exciting? You know, I get the exciting jobs. But this is really important. These are taking the big decisions about the future of pensions and things. I was the only woman in the room of a high-level thing. And we were talking about stochastic forecasting. And I thought, I've got to ask, you know. So I go, what is stochastic forecasting? And the room sort of went silent. And someone mumbled something. And then we broke for coffee. And one of the men came up and said, I'm so glad you've asked that. I always wanted to know. And another one came up over coffee and said, I've been trying to work out a definition of it. Now, you know, it shouldn't take an awkward so-and-so like me to do it. But it is about a group of people, all from such a similar background, that it's hard to say, hang on, What's that about? So if we don't have enough women or people from working class backgrounds, or indeed black and ethnic minorities, one has a very similar groupthink when you're dealing with a problem. So that can be bad for the women. They don't get the same opportunities. They don't get the same promotion because we tend to feel comfortable with people who look like, sound like us, and therefore they don't maybe get the promotion. But it isn't just them that misses out, it's the organisation, and therefore either the consumers or the patients or, you know, whatever group it is your students are trying to look after, if you don't have that. It's also much harder for women to perform well if there is that feeling of, can I really say that? You know, I'm quite a toughie. I was most of my life brought up by a man because my mother died quite young, and I think it made me more of a toughie, and I can do it. But you shouldn't have to be a toughie in order to be able to contribute, and it's much easier if you've got more women in the room. There are also assumptions. I thought it was really interesting about how you introduce somebody, and I was chatting to someone once, and it turned out we had he mentioned someone. I said, oh yeah, I was at that time the head of an organisation called Alcohol Concern. I said, oh yeah, I work with Francis. Francis was a man. I work with Francis. I didn't know you know him. He said, oh, you're working for Francis. And I said, no, he works for me. Now, I would never normally use that phrase, he works for me. I would say he works with me. Mm. But it was his assumption when I'd used the word with that it meant the other way. So it means in a room, rather like you're obviously a nurse because you're a woman. Mm. You know, I obviously was down there because I was a woman. So but that's my generation. I had hoped it finished for yours. So the other thing, I was once at a Labour Party conference. I am a Labour politician. I am therefore at Labour Party conference. I was referred to by a man as a groupie. I was quite young at the time. But even so, there were lots of men researchers around, and they're researchers. I was a woman, so I'm obviously a groupie. My husband's in the audience. He's never heard that before. Wow, that'll take some explaining, won't it? So there are the power imbalance, if you like, is the other major problem. Now, in a sense, this is the year that maybe challenged that because of all that's happening about the misuse of power. Maybe I should say the abuse of power. Because I think in the past, most of us who've been very active as feminists have thought of it much more about the sort of things I've already been talking about women not being appointed or not being promoted, and organisations not being therefore as robust and as good as they could be. But of course, that all that's happened now in the Me Too thing, and I think I've been blind to it. I think I didn't realise that some of the less toughy women, if you like, than me, have actually had sex problems from this. And I think that coming out now has been an area of the abuse of power that my generation perhaps have not been aware enough of. But I hope now that will get more solved. So, what's in a sense in common, and what do we do about it? What's in common is that this isn't just medicine, it isn't just politics, it isn't just academia. You know, this is a wide society. It's in the churches, though since I've been in the House of Lords, when all 26 bishops in the House of Lords, when I arrived, we now have 3 female bishops there. It is wonderful. But I'm sure it happens in churches. It happens in any large organisation that the people taking the decisions tend to be men. Now, we got the vote, or some of us, 100 years ago. I was involved in equal pay, but I think, you know, the Dagenham is now 50 years ago, isn't it? 40 years ago? Must be 40 because I was involved at the time. I was very involved in, when I started work, there was no maternity leave other than the civil service. No maternity leave for women. Not just very little, no maternity leave. In fact, when I started work, Some of my friends had to lie about the fact that they were married. I had a couple of friends who were air hostesses, and you weren't allowed to be an air hostess if you were married. So they used to have to take off their wedding ring and sort of wear it around their neck or something. But in those days, there was a different tax form if you were married or not. So they had to lie to the tax man, because they told them they were married, they'd be sacked as an air hostess. So, you know, that has changed because of hard work and organisation. There was, I mean, school meals. The campaign for school meals started really in 1906 for just the provision of school meals, and it still goes on. Childcare was something that we really didn't talk about, again, when I started work. It was a non-subject. I've got a friend who, when she, you know, had to go to her school, I don't know, open day or parents' day, she used to write in a business meeting in her diary, because she couldn't let anyone in her office know that she was actually going off to the school to pick up her kids or to go to a school play or something. You know, that wasn't that long ago. So these things have changed, but they didn't happen by accident. This is the bad news for you in the room, particularly those of a younger age. It takes hard work and it takes organisation. I was looking up some of the stuff from 1918, or a bit earlier, in fact before the First World War, when there was, as you know, the suffragettes were breaking windows and throwing bombs, and there was a sort of article in the Times saying, oh gosh, how are we ever going to stop this? How can we put an end to it? And there was a lovely letter from someone, a woman, saying, it's very, very easy if you want to stop women doing this. There are two options. Kill every woman, or give them the vote. They gave them the vote. But it took an enormous amount of hard work. It took a lot of trade union activity to get better rights for women. It takes a lot of collective activity. But I wanted to end with Annie Lennox, where she says that we now have to start not doing it ourselves as women, but doing it with men. And she says, I believe that in order for us to evolve and go forward, the women's movement must incorporate boys and men. Otherwise, we're still at odds with each other, and battles leave wounds. But the interesting thing is that this is for a better society. We will get better decisions. We will get a much more responsive, as I say, whether it's the church, academia, companies, anything, actually, if women are involved. So I'm afraid it means more work in order to achieve it.
Well, we probably should finish there, shouldn't we? And perhaps we could all thank our wonderful panel for coming.